It is every archaeologist's dream to make the discovery of a lifetime that turns our view of history on its head. In 2002, Vivian Davis of the British Museum made just such a discovery at this tomb at El Kab in Upper Egypt.
We began cleaning this part of the tomb, and an inscription began to emerge in red paint. Vile Kush came. And guess what we've got here? We've got an invasion of Egypt by the kingdom of Kush, not just Kush alone, as it turned out, but Kush at the head of an enormous army that covered the landscape of Egypt.
This is the story of Kush, and of its kings who became the black pharaohs who ruled Egypt. It is the story of a black African civilization that flourished for 3,000 years. Of the Nile's ancient superpowers, Kush and Egypt, who were first friends, then rivals, then enemies. It's a story that international teams of archaeologists are still uncovering in northern Sudan, the heartland of the Kingdom of Kush.
It's what I do for my work, it's what I do in my holidays, so yeah, I mean, this is the ultimate for me. And there's always the possibility of making an entirely new discovery.
We found in this pit 7 marvelous statues of kings. Exciting, surely. I didn't sleep for 2 days.
We're rewriting the ancient history of this country on a yearly basis.
Now at last, the archaeologists and their treasure trove of finds can reveal the full glories of a lost empire and the story of the Black Pharaohs history forgot. It is no wonder that Egypt, the colossus of the ancient world, has gripped our imaginations. Hardly surprising that its 3,000 years of documented history has been our Bible of the story of the Nile. Yet few of us have ever heard of the other great power on the Nile, and the thorn in Egypt's side, the Kingdom of Kush. And perhaps now is the time to redraw the map of the ancient world. Modern-day Kerma is like any other Sudanese town along the Nile. But 4,500 years ago, Kerma was the birthplace of Africa's first black superpower and the capital of the kings of Kush. Kerma is the beginning of our quest across distance and time to find out where the people of Kush came from and just how far their journey took them. It was the Nile that gave life to Egypt, and it was the Nile that created Kush. Its waters and fertile soil meant early farmers thrived, and they delivered vast wealth into the coffers of the kings of Kush.
Got to know this area really well. Back in the 90s, we did 4 seasons of survey over the whole of this region.
Derek Welsby of the British Museum has been working in northern Sudan for 2 decades.
It's a really interesting area. You can really see the pristine Kerma landscape in many cases, with all the settlements surviving in situ and all the cemeteries associated with them.
4,000 years ago, the Nile split into 3 channels around Kerma. It's along the banks of the old, dried-up river channels that the early farming communities had their villages, still clearly visible as low mounds. And what might look like a jumble of stones is a vital clue for the archaeologist to the prosperity of the region.
This building we excavated in 1997. We have many buildings of this general form in these rural settlements. When you look at the details of the construction, you can see that they were designed for storage. They have a large number of stone post pads here. These are clearly designed to support a raised floor, which will have helped protect whatever is stored here. This is a typical sort of arrangement you get even today in granaries.
Kush's farms produced a large surplus that fed urban Kerma. It made the kings of Kush extremely wealthy, and it released people from the land to develop new ideas, new skills, and new trades.
It would support a large number of builders, artisans, craftsmen, the royal household itself, a complex administration, and last but not least, the army, the thing that actually projected the power and might of Kush and allowed it to invade Egypt.
But before they became enemies, Kush and Egypt were trading partners. In ancient times, the Nile was the superhighway, north and south, and to it, and along it, flowed trade controlled by the kings of Kush at Kerma. In the desert outside the city is a recently discovered ruin which Derek thinks is a staging post on a trade route linking up with the Nile at Kerma.
We have this very distinctive pottery here, these ribbed pottery vessels, wheel-made, typical Egyptian products, being brought down here into the heartlands of the Kingdom of Kush. The pots themselves are just like the tin cans of the ancient world. They're the containers, and it's the produce within them that was being imported into this region.
Kush exported to Egypt the African goods it most desired: ivory, ebony, and wild animal skins. But above all, the pharaohs lusted after Kush's gold mines. Gold that secured the pharaoh's power and proclaimed their divinity. Gold, the flesh of gods, conferred immortality on those who wore it and were buried wrapped in it. The pharaoh's need for gold gave power to the kings of Kush, but it has taken archaeologists many years to reveal the true extent of Kushite power. In 1913, George Reisner was the first archaeologist to employ modern techniques in Sudan. He was an Egyptologist and could only see Sudan through Egypt's eyes. Reisner found many Egyptian artifacts at Kerma and was convinced that Kush was an outpost of Egypt's empire and its black African population, Egypt's slaves. Reisner's interpretations at Kerma and throughout Sudan put Kush firmly in Egypt's shadow for most of the last century.
I came here in the Sudan thinking to find Egypt, Egypt in the Sudan, but today I am very happy to find Sudan in the Sudan.
Charles Bonnet of Geneva University has dedicated a lifetime's work at Kerma to setting the record straight.
This building is probably a kind of throne room with 3 rows of wooden columns, with a conical roof and a portico with wooden columns also. That means it is a sophisticated architecture, and it is strange to see that this architecture is so old, and it is the first model known of such a building. This building has nothing to do with Egypt. It is really African.
Kush's roots were uniquely African, but its kings proved willing to adopt new ideas, especially from Egypt, as Kerma's mud brick temple shows.
So few monuments in mud brick are preserved at 20 meters high. In Egypt, there are very few. This tefufa, this huge construction, is very different than Egypt, but the general shape is like an Egyptian temple. And it is maybe the originality of what we found in Kerma. With the influences from outside, they can build something new.
Kerma's mud brick temple is an amazing survivor of 3,000 years of vandalism and erosion by wind and sand. Mud brick was the universal building material, but its ephemeral nature makes it hard for the archaeologist, and for us, to imagine just how impressive a civilization Kush was in its day. So much of it has simply vanished. New discoveries in the remote and rocky Fourth Cataract region show that as early as 2500 BC, Kush occupied far more of the Nile Valley than was previously thought.
This is a site that we certainly didn't expect to find in this area. This is a small cemetery of 19 graves dating to about 2500 BC to 2050 BC. Prior to this discovery, it was thought that the furthest upstream the first kingdom of Kush extended was about 70 kilometres from this point. But now we know that Even at a very early stage, the boundaries of the Kingdom of Kush were much more extensive than hitherto thought, and there's every possibility of finding more sites of this period further upstream in the areas not yet surveyed. It just shows that whenever you see a gap in the archaeological map of Sudan, particularly along the Nile Valley, it's simply a gap in archaeological work, not a gap in human occupation in the past.
Traveling in northern Sudan is always an expedition, but this region is particularly hostile. Driving the discoveries in the Fourth Cataract is the construction of a dam that will flood over 100 miles of one of Sudan's most beautiful landscapes, with its tumbling rapids and many small islands. It will also wipe out 150,000 years of human occupation. Pavel Wolf and his team are just one group, racing against time to record historic sites before they're flooded. But they can only provide footnotes to what should be an important chapter in Kush's story.
I think it's the most fantastic landscape I ever seen. For working, it's of course difficult, since most of the places are reachable only by foot. To reach the farther sides on the bigger islands, we have to walk, scrambling around up and down the hills for about 15 kilometers a day.
With such a vast area to cover, the team can only spend a short time at each site.
Within the first 2 to 3 weeks, we have about 100 to 120 sites discovered here, which were completely unknown. We find sites every 20 meters, more or less. Sometimes you even don't know where a site ends and where the next site begins. Judging from the sites we found, we can really say that over the centuries it was probably much more populated than it is today.
Sudan's landscape is littered with graves and cemeteries. Far harder to find are the settlements.
The best places near the river are of course still inhabited, and these are the places of the modern villages. We cannot excavate them now because they are still inhabited. After they will be left because of the flooding, there won't be the time to excavate them. What we are doing here is the last step. It's the first and the last step.
Kush occupied some 650 miles of the Nile Valley, its area of control rivaling Egypt's. Even today, getting directly from Kush's southern borders to its northern frontier is a 2-day journey. There's no tarmac, just 200 miles of unremitting desert.
Places look very close together on the map, but you've really got to work hard to get from one to another. I've been coming here for 22 years now. Usually 3 months over the winter when the climate in UK is freezing cold, so it's a good time to follow the birds down to Africa. And everyone's looking for the best route, and there's no best route, so people are just wandering all over the place. On these tracks, or on these total absence of tracks, there's no signs telling you a sharp bend or a pothole or whatever. Anything can happen at any moment. You've got to be aware all the time how careful you need to be.
We know from Egyptian records that Kush's northern frontier capital at Sai Island was the gateway for trade between the two great powers. But only one clue remains for the great metropolis that once stood here.
The main evidence we have for that comes from this cemetery over in the distance here. It's a very large cemetery dominated by some really massive tumuli, burials of very important individuals.
In a land where so much physical evidence of their civilization has turned to dust, cemeteries show us the real wealth and power wielded by the Kushites. The cemetery at Kerma was in use for over 1,000 years. At over half a square mile, its scale is awesome.
It is one of the most important cemeteries in antique time. It is enormous, with maybe 30,000 graves.
Here the kings of Kush were buried in massive tumuli 100 yards across and capped by conical blocks of white marble. The kings' bodies rested in the cemetery's huge funerary temples before being carried out along the processional way for burial. Like the pharaohs, Kushite kings took their wealth to their graves. And plenty of companions too.
When Reisner came here, he found in this passage a lot of sacrificed bodies. Reisner was thinking that it was some Negroes or slaves, but recent anthropological studies show us that it was maybe of the same family of the king.
Whether these people went to their deaths willingly remains a mystery. There's no forensic evidence to show they were executed. They seem to have just laid down and awaited a slow death as sand was piled over them.
Reisner found many statues and pieces of statue. One was extraordinary, it is Senuit.
This statue of an Egyptian noblewoman was just one of the many Egyptian grave goods Reisner found in 1916. He believed such valuable objects could only belong to Egyptians, and never considered that black Africans might have taken them from Egypt by force. Reisner should have asked himself why Egypt troubled to build a string of massive fortresses on its southern frontier. The guidebooks tell you these forts have all been swallowed up by Lake Nasser after the building of the Aswan Dam in the 1960s. But Derek Welsby decided to check this out for himself at Uranati. And Uranati still has its defenders.
Getting over here was a bit tricky, but it's great to be here. I don't think anyone else has been here, any archaeologists, for the last 30-odd years or more. Oh, it's marvellous. I always regretted the fact that I was born too late to see these sites that were flooded by Lake Nasser, but it's great that there's some of them still here. People have always wondered, why the Egyptians needed to build such massive fortifications at the same time as they're always talking about the people beyond the frontier as miserable Kush, wretched Kush. I mean, this really shows how frightened the Egyptians were of these people. These are some of the most impressive fortifications dating from the ancient world.
Around the mid-17th century BC, Egypt pulled out and the Kushite army took control of the forts. But this was no friendly changing of the guard. There had been a seismic shift in the balance of power between the two rivals. In 1650 BC, mighty Egypt was on its knees. Its pharaoh had lost control of Lower Egypt, and from the south, Kush was about to invade. The rest is history, or it is now, thanks to Vivian Davis's discovery at El Kab. He has found the missing link between what archaeology can only guess at and recorded fact. El Kab was an important Egyptian city, and its governor Sobek Nacht was keen to leave his spin on a defeat Egypt never acknowledged.
Here we're fortunate that what Sobek Nacht wants to tell us about is concerned with something very special, a great historical event that we otherwise might not have learnt about. He's keen to tell us because he himself played a heroic role in the defence of his own town. The inscription tells us that he repaired the ramparts, prepared the soldiery, and defended the town valiantly. And he goes on to say, vile Kush came. This force was enormous. It was unprecedented in size, and it covered the desert right up to the southern point of the Egyptian delta. So what we have here for the first time is an indication that the kingdom of Kush swept into Egypt right through, and as we think now, took back to Kerma, its capital, an enormous amount of loot. This loot was buried with the kings of Kush as symbols of their domination over Egypt, over the Egyptian kings.
Kush rampaged through Egypt on the smash and grab. With its saddlebags bulging with loot, the Kushite army headed home, and fatally gave Egypt time to recover. Egypt eventually struck back and took Kush's trading capital at Sai Island, opening up the frontier. The balance of power had swung Egypt's way. And now its pharaoh, Thutmose I, was hell-bent on making Kush pay the price of daring to humiliate Egypt.
Below me here is a section of the Third Cataract.
a magnificent view, but a formidable barrier to further travel upstream. Beyond it lay Kerma, the capital of the Kingdom of Kush, Egypt's ultimate goal, and the source of Egypt's past humiliation. No Egyptian army had ever penetrated this far up the Nile, but a breakthrough was achieved in about 1502 BC by Thutmose I, ordering his army to drag their boats over and around the cataract. In fact, they would have probably passed just here beyond this spot. He engaged a Kushite army and won a really decisive battle.
From another El Kab tomb, this time of an Egyptian soldier, comes an eyewitness account of how the battle went.
He describes the slaying of the Kushite ruler by Thutmose himself with the first arrow shot from his great bow. It not only describes, however, his slaying, but also rather gruesomely, the fact that his body was hung upside down from Pharaoh's boat as it sailed back in triumph to Egypt. This is a hieroglyph that actually depicts the body of the Kushite ruler hung upside down with the arrow that killed him still stuck in his chest.
Here I am at Tombos at a tremendously historic spot. This is the great victory stela of Thutmose I. It tells of a tremendous carnage, of the bodies of Kushite soldiers strewn all over the plains, of their entrails filling the valleys, of blood pouring down like rain. And all around me are giant boulders with hieroglyphs identifying Thutmose I as the great conqueror. What a statement. To anybody coming downstream, the message would have been absolutely clear. I am Thutmose, I am the conqueror of Kush.
Its king dead and its army decimated, Kerma suffered the full wrath of Thutmose's avenging army. From Kerma, Thutmose, his army and his royal cortege, including his wife and children, set out on an epic journey to the farthest limits of Kush's domain. At Kirgis, a massive white rock stands proud in the desert, a place of native veneration which Thutmose wanted to appropriate as his own.
The centerpiece of the new southern boundary are these inscriptions. 4 horizontal lines which record the words spoken by Thutmose I when he came here, words that were addressed to the Kushite Nubian population at large. And these words say, and they're a real threat and it shows that he meant business when he came here, if any Kushite should violate this stela, which my father Amun-Ra has given to me, so shall his chiefs be slain, the sky shall not rain for him, his cattle shall not calve, and there shall be no heirs of his upon earth. In other words, complete extinction if there is any interference with this boundary.
Egypt rammed home its domination of Kush, building a string of fortresses, towns, and stone temples across the country. The pharaohs meant for their monuments to endure, and this great temple at Soleb is Sudan's most majestic Egyptian ruin.
This temple dominating the landscape is a statement. It says, this land is now part of Egypt. Few of the local population would have seen anything like this. A colossal stone structure. It would have been awe-inspiring. It would have been intimidating. And it was designed to be so.
The Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep III built this temple to celebrate 30 years of his reign and his domination of Kush.
This is my favorite part of the temple. It contains a series of very impressive columns, each decorated with hieroglyphs, identifying the foreign peoples conquered by Egypt. To the right, we have the peoples of the north, among them Kadesh and Tunip. To the left, the peoples of the south, including, of course, the Kingdom of Kush. What Amenhotep III is saying here is, I am king of the known world. It all belongs to me.
The conquest of Kush brought the pharaohs vast wealth, and at last ownership of Kush's gold. The gold mines became Egypt's equivalent of Siberia, a hellish punishment zone for any Kushite who dared defy the pharaohs. And today, Sudan is still a gold mine of unrecorded archaeological sites. like the shrine to Egypt's supreme god, Amun, cut into the rock at Jebel Dosha.
Absolutely staggering. This is the first time I've ever been here. And to be here and see the sun rising over Jebel Dosha itself, to see the sun entering the shrine, you then better understand what it meant to the ancients. And this site was all about the resuscitation of the king. The sun being reborn in the morning, giving life to the king. Absolutely magical. It's a dream for anyone interested in Egyptian inscriptions to come to a site to find inscriptions that have not been seen before or not been properly recorded before. So I'm delighted to be here.
It's also the first visit here for Viv's friend and Sudanese colleague Abdul Hai. If only he could get a look in.
This is brilliant. Every sign is there, and in the right light, that will jump out at you. It's a wonderful piece. The figure here, a viceroy by the look of it, kneeling, worshipping two gods. Astonishing to think that this hasn't been noted before. Oh yes, wonderful. This is the king, Seti I, and then the gods to whom he's offering.
Who are these gods?
Stop asking me these difficult questions. It's the first time I've seen this monument, you know. And then you've got a very important little scene here where you have this kneeling man, and he's the Viceroy of Kush, Amenemhotep. Wonderful. Amenemhotep is coming to life.
The viceroys ran Kush and ensured the flow of its wealth downstream and into the pharaoh's treasury. Children of the elite were taken to Egypt to be educated, to learn Egyptian, dress like Egyptians, and return to Kush to administer for Egyptians. Eventually, the descendants of this elite would use their knowledge to once again turn the tables on Egypt. And for the next shift in the balance of power between Kush and Egypt, we must travel south. And another punishing two-day journey for Derek Wellesby.
It's nice when the day's driving's over. We've no telly, we've none of these other things that make life pleasurable. So you have a cup of tea, you have a cigarette, you wash your feet.
And Derek's campsite might prove interesting to later generations of archaeologists.
We're creating archaeology all the time, and sometimes it's rather silly because we're travelling around in the desert and you want to make a campfire, so you collect 3 stones together and make a little shelter. Now, if we were to find a Neolithic example of that, we'd get so excited. In archaeology, you're looking at small bits of evidence and trying to build up the whole story. It's very difficult to try and build up a picture of people's lives from the material that they just discarded.
In the far south of Kush, just after the Nile leaves the fourth cataract, a lone mountain rises from the desert. Jebel Barkal holds the key to a momentous shift in Kush's history. At the foot of Jebel Barkal, Egypt built a massive fortress to defend its southern frontier capital. The pharaohs were to make Jebel Barkal the second most important religious complex in their empire.
When the Egyptians first arrived in this area, they decided that one of the ancestral homes of their state god Amun was actually this mountain. Jebel Barkal is a unique feature with a large pinnacle sticking out of the front, and the Egyptians named this mountain the Pure Mountain and believed that it was the southern home of their state god Amun, who actually dwelt within the mountain, and the pinnacle was the uraeus, the symbol of kingship.
The uraeus, or the cobra, adorns the crown of all pharaohs. But for all the power that Egypt's pharaohs drew from Jebel Barkal, there's hardly a trace above ground of the great religious complex they built here.
Most of what we actually see on the site at the foot of Jebel Barkal today dates from a later period, but beneath these later temples there were earlier Egyptian temples. The fact that there was a large fortress here, I mean, one would expect to be able to find these. Egyptian fortresses were absolutely massive structures, but we've neither found remains of the town, of the fortress, or of the associated cemeteries.
But one thing is clear. Jebel Barkal was now the southern home of the supreme god Amun, and whoever ruled here had a divine right to rule both Kush and Egypt. Egypt's pharaohs had unwittingly set up their own downfall and the rise of the Black Pharaohs. Egypt's control of Kush ended around 1100 BC, when troubles at home made a retreat inevitable. Around 900 BC, a new Kushite dynasty emerged from the shadows. Kings who were to mastermind the second coming of Kush. Their story begins at El Kuru, a few miles downstream from Jebel Barkal.
The important thing about El Kuru is that it's really our major evidence indicating the origins of the Second Kingdom of Kush.
Tim Kendall has extensively researched the cemetery at El Kuru.
There evidently was an important dynasty here. I think the modest size of the tombs probably don't indicate their power and wealth. What we see here is a tomb sequence that begins with a very Kushite tomb. It's round, just like at Kerma. And then with each successive royal pair, we see the very rapid evolution to Egyptian burial customs. These people who are not ethnically Egyptian, suddenly they're adopting Egyptian practices. What's going on here?
Kush's new rulers had designs on Egypt's wealth and a brilliant plan. At Jebel Barkal, they revived the Egyptian cult of Amun and restored the temple complex.
Here we see exactly how the Kushites imagined Jebel Barkal. This is a temple built to the goddess Mut. Mut was the wife of Amun, who dwelled in the mountain with her husband. The texts tell us that they're inside Jebel Barkal, and here is the cliff, and the pinnacle is represented as a giant uraeus, the symbol of kingship.
And it was Egypt's crown that the new kings of Kush now claimed. The pharaoh's declaration that Amun of Jebel Barkal had given them the right to rule both Kush and Egypt had exploded in their faces. In 750 BC, Egypt was in chaos, the remnants of power held by its priesthood. The priests welcomed a return to order through the kings of Kush, who could rule Egypt with the authority of Amun of Jebel Barkal. And so Pianki, king of Kush, swept into Egypt. The time of the Black Pharaohs had come. The vanquished were now the victors, and Pianki and his successors would rule over the riches of Egypt for the next century. But military campaigns and ceremonial occasions aside, Kushite pharaohs left the daily running of Egypt to their womenfolk, as Betsy Bryan explains.
These are the funerary chapels of the gods' wives of Amun, and in fact, Amenirtis and Shep-en-Wepet, who are represented here, are members of the royal family of the Kushites. These women, in fact, were left very much to their own devices because their brothers are busy doing other things. So these women represented the Kushite family at the head of Egypt itself. This is a representation of Shep-en-Wepet, and she is shown in the way that the ancient Egyptians showed Kushites as a separate ethnic group from them. She has a very broad face, but also around the outside of her nose there is a slight fold, almost a wrinkle of flesh, which we call the Kushite fold. And here Shep-en-Wepet was perfectly happy to be shown as an ethnic Kushite in her own monument because she was very proud of the fact that she was a royal family member.
The Kushite rulers of Egypt never tried to present themselves as Egyptians. They had very distinctive royal regalia. They used their Sudanese names, and not one of them was buried in Egypt. They all came back to this place.
4 Kushite black pharaohs were buried at El Kuru, their tombs meticulously excavated by Reisner. But once again, his interpretations buried the real story.
Reisner excavated Kuru and did a very good job of it. However, his conclusions are a bit bizarre. He believed that there was a branch of the Libyan royal family that came down here and ruled it over the local people. Libyan is a kind of watchword for light-skinned. So it was kind of a racist interpretation of history based on his own biases.
The greatest of all the forgotten black pharaohs was Taharqa. In 690 BC, he ascended to the thrones of Kush and Egypt in a reign that was to last 26 years. In time-honored fashion, Taharqa made the great Egyptian monuments his own.
Taharqa really built an enormous entranceway here in Karnak to essentially take over the largest temple complex in the world. And it was already a completed temple, and all he had to do was to put this huge monumental colonnade up. That transformed the whole temple into a Kushite monument. Essentially, Karnak became his.
At home, Taharqa adorned monuments claiming, "Never before had the like been seen since the time of the gods." And he showed himself doing what pharaohs must, holding up the heavens and maintaining order in the cosmos. At Kawa, Taharqa's temple sits within a whole city still buried in the sand, which Derek Welsby will excavate over the next 10 years.
You can't come and see this temple without seeing this, because this is the man himself, the man who created the thing. This is Taharqa here, processing towards a series of gods on the wall of his own temple, which he built between 684 and 680 BC.
The sand still holds many of Taharqa's and Kush's secrets, as Tim Kendall discovered.
Well, we were driving from Khartoum to Jebel Barkal, and it's about a whole day's drive, endless miles of sand, and we're kind of lost. And I looked out the window and thought I saw a column drum, thought I was dreaming, and then another one went by, and another one. Suddenly we found this incredible sight, just like in the movies. I mean, the implications of this place are enormous. I mean, here it is, a prominent Kushite town, and it's 60 kilometers from the Nile. So there must be a whole string of settlements between here and there. One of the wonderful things about this site is that it opens up an entire new area of the Sudan that has never really been explored archaeologically, and it makes us realize how much there is here that hasn't been found or recognized yet. I mean, we're rewriting the ancient history of this country on a yearly basis.
During his long reign, Taharqa became known far and wide. He is even mentioned in the Bible, aiding the king of Judea in his war with Assyria. And Assyria would test Taharqa's strength soon enough. How Taharqa organized his army remains a mystery, but some evidence for it remains way out in the desert, which Derek Welsby wants to see for himself.
We're going right up into the lower Wadi Hawar to see a massive Kushite fortress at Galu Abu Ahmed. It's only discovered in the 1980s. It's a really special place. Apparently there's a very big dune field between us and this fortress, so you've got to go really fast so you don't get stuck in the sand. But if they're Balkan dunes, they have an almost vertical face on the south side, and you go over those at speed, and that's the end of it, I'm afraid. It's hopeless. Stuck again. They're very soft, these dunes on top. Go straight down to the axles. And there it is, right across the wadi there. God, it's massive. Much bigger than I thought it was going to be. Really impressive. We're really out in the sticks here. You've got this massive fortification. It sort of reminds one of the French Foreign Legion fortresses.
Even half buried by sand, the scale here is formidable. The fort's gateways are heavily defended, and the 5-meter-thick walls are studded with large projecting towers.
For an archaeologist interested in military fortifications, you can't get much better than this.
Within these huge ruins, there are only tiny clues to the lives of the soldiers stationed here.
There's a lot of ostrich eggshell beads here. Whether the soldiers like to dress themselves up in beads, or whether it was the travellers passing through, or whether the soldiers lived here with their families, we just don't know. This would not be one of the best postings, I wouldn't have thought, in the Kushite army. It must have been an absolute desperate place to be.
A far worse posting was to the front line of a war with Assyria. When Assyria attacked Egypt, Taharqa couldn't hold the line, and in a defeat that neither he nor Kush would recover from, Taharqa was driven out of Lower Egypt. Taharqa died in 664 BC, but not before building himself a magnificent pyramid across the river from Jebel Barkal.
It's always taken as a reflection of the power and the wealth of a pharaoh, the size of his pyramid, and if that equation is actually correct, then obviously Taharqa had a very high opinion of himself. Originally, he built a pyramid 28.5 meters square out of white limestone, but because he lived to such a ripe old age and had a different perception of his own value, he decided to make his pyramid even bigger. So once the pyramid was completely finished, he then had his workmen encase it in a massive pyramid, the largest that a Kushite ruler ever built.
When Taharqa's nephew, Tanwetamani, became pharaoh, he described a vision in which the goddesses handed him Egypt's crown. In his first year as pharaoh, Tanwetamani defeated the Assyrians, but the dream couldn't hold. The following year, the Assyrians returned and drove Kush out of Egypt for good. Tanwetamani's burial chamber gives us a final glimpse of the glory of the Kushite black pharaohs.
Here we see the king being escorted into his tomb by two gods. And the representation of the king is really quite fantastic. It's one of the two surviving paintings of a Kushite king that we have. And here we see all the classic Kushite royal regalia. The so-called cap crown with double cobras or uraei over his brow, which symbolized his rule of Egypt and Kush. And on the other wall is the king being escorted out of the tomb, and according to the Book of the Dead, assume any form of existence which pleased him. This was an eternal cycle. The king was supposed to live this way forever.
When Reisner excavated the burial chamber, he found it completely empty, long plundered of all the treasures Tanwetamani would have brought home from Egypt.
The tomb is interesting because it's a classic example of a royal tomb of that day, and you can see that it's a miniature universe. Overhead is a starry sky, and the walls are inscribed with texts from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Unfortunately, the paintings are damaged. When we go over to the tomb of Tanwetamani's mother, we find an almost identical tomb where the paintings are very well preserved. Over here, she's shown as though she were just buried, lying in her bandaged mummy case. And on this side, we have the queen sort of rolling over and reviving because this god is holding to her nose this sign of life. And underneath, you can see a collection of gold objects, the kind of things that would have filled the tomb: scepters, bows, crowns. These two tombs are really masterpieces of Kushite art. They're the best preserved we have in the Sudan.
Tanwetamani was the last Kushite black pharaoh. Nevertheless, Kush retained its adopted Egyptian customs. Amun remained its state god, and Kushite kings and queens continued to be buried under pyramids for another 1,000 years. Sudan has some 300 pyramids, 3 times as many as were built in Egypt. And Kush continued to be a thorn in Egypt's side. Its kings still aspired to be black pharaohs. Until 594 BC, when Egypt's pharaoh, Psammetichus II decided to crush their ambitions for good. In one symbolic act of destruction, he gave Charles Bonnet the discovery of his lifetime.
Exciting, surely. I didn't sleep for 2 days. We found in this pit 50 fragments of 7 marvelous statues of kings. Psammetichus II broke the statue of the king ancestor because they were afraid of these kings. And he put the pieces of statue in a pit. For us, it is an historical discovery, very important.
Psammetichus trashed the temples, burned the royal palace, came here to just put an end to this cult once and for all, to say, okay boys, the game's up, you're out of it.
The move of the royal capital to Merowe marks the final stage of the Kushites' long journey, and of ours too. At Merowe, the wheel turned full circle. Kush and Egypt once again became trading partners, and Kush remained a player on the world stage, well known to the Greeks and Romans.
It's interesting just to think at the time that the city of Rome was founded, Kush was a major world power, and Kush was still a major power in the 4th century AD at the time of the decline of the Roman Empire. So it spans a vast range of time and was an important state for a very considerable period.
Merowe's magnificent royal cemetery is the end of our journey. These pyramids belong to all the Kushite kings and queens from the 3rd century BC to the 4th century AD.
Just down the hill here are the latest royal tombs of the Kushite dynasty, over 1,000 years after the time of Pianki and Taharqa. Sudan has been totally eclipsed by Egypt. People think that Abu Simbel is the absolute limit of civilization up the Nile, but here there's untold riches. Sudan is what I do, and will be till the end of my days.
Merowe's pyramids are a lasting testimony to the glory of Kush, the land of the black pharaohs that history forgot.
Next week, Women of the Gold Rush tells the story of 3 adventurous Irish women who risked everything for life in America's frontier. 9:30 next Thursday night. Coming up, late edition news, then live from Abbey Road.